EBB ABS Training Webinars. This webinar is part of a series providing an introduction to EU access and benefit sharing regulations. It was developed by the Interreg-funded European Blue Biobank project. The European Blue Biobank project, or EBB, is a European Marine Biological Resource Centre project to promote compliance with access and benefit sharing frameworks for genetic resources derived from the Nagoya Protocol. It aims to facilitate sustainable access to marine biodiversity, its associated data, and extractable products for local and international academia and industry users. It also aims to incentivize biodiversity conservation in coastal ecosystems and provides tools to achieve these aims. These are the EBB Trace Database, a searchable catalogue of marine biological resources provided by the EBB Biobank, the EBB Track Tool for provision of macroorganisms, service supply, and biobank management, and the EBB EMBRC Best Practice Guide, a handbook for ABS compliance, which provides recommendations to marine biological resource collections and users' institutions, and the practical guide for users, Seek, Keep and Transfer, a step-by-step guide to ABS compliance when utilising marine genetic resources. This webinar is part of a series that is designed to provide an introduction to EU access and benefit sharing regulations for collections and users. Webinar 1 provides an introduction to ABS. Webinar 2 provides an overview of the scope of the EU ABS regulation on ABS compliance. Webinar 3 provides recommendations for institutions with users and collections of marine genetic resources. Webinar 4 considers managing ABS compliance and collections. Webinar 5, it provides an overview of compliance for users and a review of Seek, Keep and Transfer, a step-by-step guide to ABS compliance when utilising marine genetic resources. Webinar 6 discusses the EU registers, that is the registered collections and best practices as tools to support ABS compliance. We particularly draw your attention to the two handbooks provided by the project, the EBB EMBRC Best Practice Guide to ABS Compliance. This handbook is aimed at users, institutions and collection managers of marine biological resources. It provides an introduction, background and overview of ABS, user-friendly guidance to implementing ABS best practices for institutions. It covers a wide range of possible scenarios and includes technical guidelines and supporting material. Seek, Keep, Transfer is a practical guide for users of genetic resources. Users are guided through a 6-step process to perform ABS due diligence. And Webinar 5 provides a full overview of the guide. The following webinar and subsequent webinars in this series have been developed as introductory guides based on the EBB handbook and step-by-step guide. While the authors have aimed to make the information as accurate and up-to-date as possible, ABS is complex and evolving. The authors are not responsible for the results of any actions taken by institutions or users on the basis of information that is not within this webinar nor the EBB guides. The recommendations in this webinar do not supersede official texts or substitute for ABS policies that institutions may already have in place. Further specific information and support is available, and it is recommended that dedicated ABS support is sought from either the home organisation or from the ABS competent national authority for research in their country. Webinar 4 provides an overview of managing ABS compliance in collections. This webinar begins by introducing the EBB EMBRC Best Practice Guide to ABS compliance, and then provides an overview of the technical guidelines and annexes from that guide, which are most relevant to ABS compliance, management and collections. The webinar then describes in more detail technical guidelines and annexes. These include Technical Guideline 1 on the acquisition of genetic material, Annex 4 on the genetic resources database fields required for internal ABS management, Technical Guideline 2, depositing material in collections, and Technical Guideline 4, supplying or transferring genetic resources to third parties. And then finally, Technical Guideline 6, the disposal or deaccession of genetic material. As mentioned in the introduction, the EBB EMBRC Best Practice Guide to ABS Compliance has been developed to support EMBRC partners to meet the requirements of compliance under the EU ABS regulation in terms of collecting, transferring, and using genetic resources. These provide a clear, user-friendly guide for implementing best practice. Part 1 of the Best Practice Guide provides the legal framework and derived obligations related to access and benefit sharing, focusing on compliance with the EU ABS regulations, as well as other regulations that affect marine research, together with information and general recommendations to familiarise and meet the requirements for ABS compliance. Part 2 gives practical and specific information in the form of technical guidelines to help institutions to develop the required policies and training to implement the best practices and ensure ABS compliance, with annexes containing templates, forms, diagrams and illustrations to aid understanding and help with compliance. It is the second part of the guide that this webinar is focused on. The technical guidelines in Part 2 outline best practices and make recommendations for implementation. Technical guidelines 1, 2, 4 and 6 are of particular relevance for managing ABS compliance in collections. They cover ABS compliance around acquiring genetic resources, depositing genetic resources in collections, supply and transfer, as well as the permanent disposal or removal of genetic resources. The Best Practice Guide also provides practical guidance, including template documents as annexes. Annex 1 provides templates and contracts for ABS compliance. These include a model for sample terms and conditions for academic use, a model sample material transfer agreement, and a model material accession form. Annex 2 provides benefit sharing conditions. These may be monetary or non-monetary. Annex 4 and 6 consider data management in a biological resource centre and in a project. And finally, Annex 5 provides an awareness poster, "Don't be a biopirate," that can be used to inform staff and visitors of ABS requirements generally. Technical Guideline 1 refers to the acquisition of genetic resources, either by collection in the field or temporary or permanent acquisition from other sources such as collections. It also covers situations such as material that's entered an institution by unsolicited donation. To support implementation and understanding, the technical guideline outlines the required steps to comply with access and benefit sharing regulations, provides summary flowcharts and tables, and a list of recommendations. Institutions that acquire genetic resources should exercise due diligence to ascertain that these have been legally accessed in compliance with ABS regulations, and the required information should be retained for 20 years. Key annex recommendations are that institutions should ensure that acquisition by fieldwork is compliant with the provider country's access laws, and where required, prior informed consent and mutually agreed terms and/or other relevant permits or conditions are obtained. Material acquired from ex situ collections should be accessed under agreed terms. When biological material is received through other routes, such as donation or transfer from visitors, steps ensure as far as reasonably possible that the material is acquired in accordance with applicable law. Annex 4 provides genetic resource database fields required for internal ABS management. Institutions are required to ensure long-term traceability of data relating to the acquisition, maintenance, and distribution of genetic resources. All institutions are recommended to define, document, and implement a strategy to ensure that genetic resource databases are secure and regularly backed up in order to minimize the risk of loss of data. In accordance with the EU ABS regulation, relevant ABS information should be kept for 20 years. Annex 4 provides a list of obligatory and recommended data fields for institution databases. Harmonization of data field labels according to the list is preferable, but it is not obligatory to have exactly the name proposed in the list, as long as there is an equivalent field name for which the content fits the description given in the list. Technical Guideline 2 provides guidance and recommendations for depositing genetic resources in collections. The standard material accession form will facilitate recording and tracking the required information to check whether the genetic resource is in scope of ABS regulations and to document information to meet due diligence obligations. The depositor should be able to demonstrate that the material was legally accessed and provide relevant documentation, including PIC and MAT and subsequent agreements. Annex 1 of the Best Practice Guide provides a model example. Internal policies or procedures around acquisition should ensure that collections only accept materials that are legally accessed and where terms and conditions can be met. Checks and procedures should include standard depositor checks to ensure that the material was legally accessed and the depositor has the authority to deposit the resource, processes for checking any data gaps, processes to manage and archive key documents, including tracking of key checks, terms of benefit and their feasibility, acceptability, and process for contacting the competent authority in the provider country and any third party should issues arise around legality or other aspects of the resource. Technical Guideline 4 outlines best practice around supply or transfer of genetic resources to third parties. Institutions should ensure that transference is compliant with conditions set in the PIC and MAT, and that material should only be transferred to third parties if this is permitted. Material should always be supplied under relevant terms laid out in a material transfer agreement. By this material transfer agreement, the third party will undertake to use the biological material only in a manner compliant with the original PIC and MAT. Any restrictions or requirements should be made clear and information required for due diligence transferred. The use of standard MTAs facilitates supply, and model examples are provided in Annex 1 of the Best Practice Guide. Institutions should provide genetic resources together with ABS documentation which will allow the user to exercise due diligence. Material should only be transferred to third parties if this is permitted by PIC and MAT. Institutions should have policies and procedures in place to track and record the supply of genetic resources in accordance with due diligence obligations, ensure biological material is supplied temporarily or permanently to third parties only on terms and conditions consistent with those under which it was acquired. You should use standard material transfer agreements to facilitate third-party supply and utilisation in line with terms and conditions. Material transfer agreements should differentiate between commercial and non-commercial use, as well as change in ownership, and should address ownership and intellectual property rights of any product or derivate resulting from utilisation of original samples. Should handle inappropriate or prohibited utilisation of such material, for example, through notification of the checkpoint or national focal point of the user's country, and ensure third parties are aware of any restrictions or requirements, and renegotiate terms with provider countries where required. Technical Guideline 6 outlines processes around the disposal and removal of a genetic resource. It is recommended that institutions have processes to manage deliberate and accidental destruction and the disposal of genetic resources. Disposal, destruction, or permanent transfer should always be in line with ABS requirements with the provider country as outlined in the mutually agreed terms or the material transfer agreement. Institutions should have policies and procedures in place to track if the original PIC, MAT, or MTA requires the genetic resource to be destroyed, that destruction or other disposal has taken place, and the provider country informed. The use of genetic resources, including complete consumption and disposal, should be recorded, and when and how specimens permanently leave the ownership, custodianship of the institution, including permanent transfer of ownership to a third party, and loss of genetic resource by collection staff or third parties. The next webinar in this series will address compliance for users, seek, keep and transfer, a step-by-step guide to ABS compliance when utilising marine genetic resources. Thank you for watching this webinar, and the authors would like to remind you that this webinar is a general introduction to ABS and that the disclaimer provides important information that we would like to draw your attention to. To ensure compliance with ABS, you should refer to official texts and seek advice from your organisation or the ABS competent national authority in the state in which you work.